Hey, good morning, guys. Yes, I am finally doing an epoxy ramp video. That starts next. Stick around. I say finally because that is probably the most common question I get asked about, and that is how do I do epoxy ramps? I have a new rod building series coming. It's called Rod Building Basics, and there is going to be an epoxy ramp video in that as I'm going along building a rod, but because I get so many questions about epoxy ramps, and I have it in a few of my other videos, but it's not as detailed as we're going to get here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to mix up some epoxy. All right, let's get started. So I've got my mixing cup. I got my Diamond 2 high build epoxy from Voodoo, which this is my preferred epoxy. There's others out there. They may behave a little bit differently, but they're all going to be close to what you're about to see. So let's mix up some epoxy. I will always mix 3 milliliters of each part because it really needs to be a 1-to-1 mix. And the smaller the batch you make, the more critical your measuring has to be, and the greater chance for an error in your ratio, which means your epoxy is not going to function as well as you would like. So I've got 3 mil of the black cap, which is the part A. Put in 3 mil of the white cap, which is the part B. Okay, and now we're going to mix for 3 minutes. Now we've got our epoxy mixed. Normally, I'm going to do this as I'm doing the first and second coat of epoxy on my guide. So what I got set up here in the wrapper, this was the example I did for you guys on under wraps. It's on a broken rod. I got a bunch of rods behind me there that are in various stages of the build, but none of them are ready for epoxy ramps yet. So I put this masking tape here, just build a quick arbor up that's going to simulate either the front of the reel seat or grip that you're going to build an epoxy ramp next to. Let me get this covered, and then we'll talk about how to do the actual ramp. I've got my thread work coated here. All right, nice smooth coat on the thread work with the brush strokes running down the blank, so as the blank turns, it will wipe out any extra brush strokes you have in here just by the epoxy falling as the blank turns. Now, here's where the trick is for epoxy ramps. You have to wait. You have to wait for the epoxy to get right, and right now it is still way too thin. You got 3 minutes of mix time, and then you probably have somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes of usable time before the epoxy really starts to set. Now, that much time for me, I'll start at the end of the rod and work my way down, doing the guides, taking care of any areas where I'm going to put, either a label, or I've already got my label on. I've got my hook keeper here. This is an epoxy ramp that was put on this rod. I've got epoxy ramps here. I mean, I will be doing something else in that first, 4 to 8 minutes with the epoxy. All the time the epoxy's, getting thicker, and it's getting close now. Have to give that another minute or so, because this is going to be the trick. Here we go. Epoxy's still running a little bit too much in the cup. Too liquidy at this point. You want to wait till it gets pretty stiff. I mean, where it will come off of your brush really slowly. Now it's dripping pretty good because you need this epoxy to be getting very close to its last minutes of usability to do the epoxy ramps, at least the way I do them. And I don't know how everybody else does them. I never found a video or any explanation on epoxy ramps. I just started playing around with it a long time ago and had some that looked horrible. And then I had some that started to look really cool. So I kept doing it. So we're getting close. We're getting close here. Now, you need to put your blank in your dryer. In mine, I just got to flip it over. I've got it in my, chucked up in my Alps power wrapper. I'm just going to put it in the dry. Now we've got it turning in your dryer. I like it turning in this direction where the bottom is coming up and going this way. That way I can see what I'm doing with the epoxy. Alright, so here we go. Epoxy's getting about right. So what I'll do is I'll load my brush with epoxy and I'm going to let it run. I'm not really going to brush it onto the blank. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drip it onto the blank and let it start building up. Now this is a very high transition to this tape. If you had a really fat grip, that's what it's going to simulate. Okay. Now it's still trying to run off the bottom, so the epoxy's still not quite to the point where it wants to do an epoxy ramp. But you could do a shallow ramp here at this point without any problem. Now, oops, I just dripped it on me. That's the other thing, is that whatever you're working on, make sure you have paper towels underneath, because epoxy just dripped off the blank turning because I've got too much on it for the amount of set that's going on in the epoxy. So I'm going back in. I'm still dipping and dripping. I'm going to drip some more on. Now, when you start to manipulate the epoxy, what you're going to do, you don't really brush it. You're just going to pull it. So I'll load my brush one more time, and I'm going to get it to where I'm not really brushing the blank. I'm just manipulating the epoxy with the tip of the brush, and I'm going to pull it towards my transition piece. I'll need a little more epoxy in there. Epoxy's still not quite set enough. But you can start to see the ramp build. Now, the steeper the ramp that you want, the later you're going to wait to start this process. You're going to start with a much thicker epoxy. If you want a very gently sloping ramp, you just pick up some more on your brush and start building out towards the toe of your ramp, and it'll run out that way. Also, if at any point you don't like the way this looks, stop your dryer. Most of it will run off into your paper towel or whatever you've got underneath it. Hopefully you've got something under it. Okay, we're still not quite ready for the final because it's still dripping. There's a piece that just dripped off. Okay, we'll give it a few more minutes. Let this epoxy cure a little bit more, and then we'll finish this ramp. Getting close. One way to tell is that if you will load your brush and then wipe it on the inside of your cup and watch how the epoxy behaves. See, that ran down pretty quick. Let's try that again. You see it maybe this time. Epoxy is still very fluid. We're waiting still for this epoxy to get a little closer to its set point. Now we're going to go ahead and build this ramp. I'm going to run this ramp out from this accent piece here. We're going to build a pretty long ramp. Again, I'm not brushing it on, I'm dripping it on, and then I'm going to manipulate it, just have it drag to even up the end of the ramp. Oh, I got one spot that's missing a little bit right there. You have to catch it. Time it where it turns if you got a spot. Well, that filled up pretty nicely. Alright, this stuff is starting to get right. So now we're going to start building the high end of the ramp up against your grip. Or in this case, our fake grip. Now it's sticking to the edge and still rolling around, but it's starting to really adhere to the edge of your grip. Now I got a little careless and got a little bit of epoxy up here on top of what would be the grip. Now I always have these paper towel squares cut. I cut a bunch of them in advance with a pair of scissors, just fold and cut. Got my handy dandy rubbing alcohol here. I'm just going to fold it so I've got a nice clean straight edge, and I'm going to wipe the edge of the grip where I don't want epoxy. Now if that's a cork grip or an EVA grip, you might want to do that a couple times just to make sure that you don't have epoxy up there. Now we'll do it one more time when we're done building this, but I'm going to clean it up as much as I can at the moment. So a little bit of rubbing alcohol in a paper towel square, fold your sharp edge, and just hold some tension on it to keep that edge nice and straight. And it's peeling. All the epoxy is off your grip. Here's a common problem with these epoxy ramps is this has picked up a bubble. Now I don't know if you can see it right there. And we're going to try a couple different things to get rid of the bubble. First thing we're going to do is we're going to try to just pull it just with the very tip of your brush in the epoxy, pulling that bubble out. The other thing you can do is just stop your dryer motor for a minute and let it run, and that bubble will run. It just disappeared. It ran around this side. All this epoxy is running off. Start it back up. Change directions on it. And the bubble's gone, but so is most of your ramp because we started a little too early. Now the epoxy is really getting to where it's at a workable stage. You can feel the viscosity of it starting to thicken up. So we're going to start again here. We pulled most of that off by stopping the rod, but there's still quite a bit left on there. So I'll start dripping it on in the area that I want the ramp the thickest. Normally a ramp this tall I would do in 2 or 3 different applications. I'm going to try to do it in one application today for you guys. But you could build half of the ramp up, let it cure as your threads are curing, and then the next day come back and put the other half in and get built the rest of the way. When you build them really high like this, you are more prone to bubbles. And then we picked up another bubble, but I'm going to leave it just so we can finish. In my personal rods, I don't care, honestly, about the bubbles so much. They pick up the sunlight pretty cool, and you get a nice reflection. Sparkling, you can't really tell it's a bubble. Certainly not from arm's length, you can't tell. If you get up close to it and look at it, you can. If I'm doing this for a client, I'll keep taking them off and putting them back on until I get one that's absolutely clear, like these on this rod are here, or these are perfect. This rod got broken about 2 weeks after I built it by a client. And they came back and I stripped the hardware off and built him another one at a much lower cost because he didn't have to pay for all the hardware again. I stripped the guides and the tip top off. It's starting to build nicely now. Again, you can see a bubble or two in it. And now what I'm doing is just picking up the excess that's trying to drop and hanging on to it with the tip of the brush to hold it in place. Now, like I said before, typically I build these after I've done a complete guide train and maybe even more, a grip or in between and a split grip or something like that. So my epoxy is typically much older than it is now. And I may have jumped the gun and started this too early. So we're going to give this just a few more minutes and then we'll finish this ramp up. Don't go away. One thing we haven't talked about is why I use epoxy ramps. Well, first of all, I don't like the rubber winding checks. You can use them. They come in most kits. It's a lot easier to do in the beginning to slide and glue up a rubber winding check. I think they look a little cheesy, but that's just my personal opinion. You can also get anodized aluminum painted winding checks. They are kind of pricey. You have to do a lot of precise measuring and order them exactly unless you're going to have, 500 of them in your inventory, which is not likely. But I've built a few of those. It just takes a lot longer, in my opinion, because I will do a rough fit of all my components, do some precise measuring with my calipers, and then order the correct aluminum checks. I find, at least my opinion is, these epoxy ramps give you a much cooler look. And what you'll be able to see here is it looks like it is magnified. So if you have some accent trim pieces that are underneath your ramp, they're really going to explode just like they would under a magnifying glass. They look great. One of the other things I will do sometimes is I will add some of the metal flake. That does two things. The metal flake particles mixed in your epoxy cuts down on your bubbles. Plus, if you do a very subtle metal flake, for instance, if I'm on a black blank without a lot of bling on it, I will take a black flake and add to it just a little bit. Really kind of pops in the sunlight without being overly blingy. Also, you can use marbling mud, which I am going to do a video on how to do marbling probably within the next month. So here we go. The epoxy is finally getting to the point where it's really workable for doing epoxy ramps. You can see it on the side of the cup. This really kind of stays in a bit of a puddle before it starts running down. It's starting to stay to the end and along a little bit of a stringy. You can keep a pretty good puddle in the tip of your brush. So it's getting to the point where it is the easiest to do the epoxy ramps. Like I said in the beginning, dealing with epoxy is all about timing. Has a lot to do with the kind of epoxy it is, has a lot to do with the temperature of the epoxy, the temperature in the rod building space. So we're getting close, really close. Now see, that took forever to drip off once I stopped spinning it. And if I stopped spinning this rod, a good portion of it would still run off, but it would, a lot of it would stay on. So let's finish this up real quick. Alright, so now we're going to do the final touches here. I'm still just loading the epoxy on the blank. And then I'm going to catch where it's about to drip with my brush and just pull it down the blank. I'm going to put a little bit more in here. Okay, we're in the home stretch. I'm going to do the last touches here. And this is just me looking at the profile of the ramp from the side. You guys will be looking at it from the top here. You can see it's starting to take that ramp shape just touching up the bottom of the ramp here. And grab some of this about to drip and pull it out towards the toe of the ramp. There you go. Epoxy ramps made sort of simple. At least you know the tricks now. Alright guys, just to sum up here, a couple of quick tips. One, don't be afraid to play with epoxy right up until it's sticking to your brush and won't come out. I would suggest you take an old blank or a stick or something, put it in your dryer, practice, build yourself a tape arbor just like this one, practice up against it a little bit. Your first one's not going to come out great. My first couple didn't come out great, but they were for me and my rods. I didn't really care that much. I just kept playing with it and experimenting with the epoxy. Second tip, don't be afraid to start over. Scrape it off, stop your dryer, scrape it off, start again. And then the last thing is, get creative with it. I've done thousands of these epoxy ramps. I've built over 1,000 rods now. Most of my rods have at least 3 ramps in them. They get to be pretty easy to do. They're second nature to me now. You just have to practice like anything else. And then the last tip is, don't skimp on your epoxy. Go ahead and mix up a full batch, even though you're going to throw about half of it away. That is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. If your epoxy ratio is not perfect, it will not do this. It's going to run off. It's not going to set right. It's going to turn opaque and not be clear. Just go ahead and use the full 3 milliliters of each part and prepare to throw it away. Or build a couple at the same time. If I was doing all 3 of these ramps at one time, I would use a full probably 6 milliliters of epoxy. And if I'm doing them as I'm building the rest of the rod, you'll be down to scraping the epoxy out of your cup by the time you're doing a ramp. Coming up soon, like I might start shooting them today, I'm going to start building a rod, and it's going to be rod building basics. It's going to be every step of a rod building process broken down into maybe 5 to 7 minute videos. The last 2 videos I did with the Cobra rod, I kind of jammed them all into 2 videos just so you would have it all in one place. Starting here very soon, there'll be little bitty pieces of video for you guys to digest, go back and watch it again and again till you get good at something, or refer back to it 6 months from now when you forgot how to do it. Anyway, that's coming along with the Voodoo rod builds. I was talking to Casey this morning. They are ready to go up on the site where you'll be able to buy a kit. I ordered my kit this morning. I'm going to build a 7-foot white blank, medium heavy, fast, with a split EVA grip. And you guys can grab your kit and build along with me. When I'm done with mine, we're going to put it up over at ultimatebass.com. I'll put the link down in below. And we're going to do a raffle to raise money for the Adopt a Family program for next Christmas. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.